This video is a recording of the second part of the conversation that we had in our first Courageous Conversation held in Greyton on the 8th of July 2024. If you haven't watched the first part of the video, there should be a link below where you can see it. This part of the conversation may not make much sense unless you've seen it. And here we talk about what role the Valley could play in the transition into the fifth phase of human consciousness. So in this case, we have a look at what does it mean to collaborate, and it's more than just working with each other, with the people that are in the Valley. There's the framing for that in the first conversation. So what we look at here initially is collaboration at the very different levels at which it can happen. The first is what we refer to as place-based. That's a very specific region that can be easily identified by a particular kind of culture, the people, the climate, and all the rest. And in this case, our place-based area is the Valley of Six, which stretches from Greyton all the way through to Bereaville, with all of the settlements that are included among them. There was some discussion about whether it should be wider than that, including all of the farmers around that. And then we said that there's no hard and fast rule here, and it'll be up to us to determine what we mean by our place-based initiative, or the next level, which is bioregionally, and that means a wider river basin type area. So for this particular river basin, we're a tributary of the Breda River. Breda River starts near Ceres and then runs all the way down to Witstrand. The Riviersonner end converges with the Breda River just before Swellendam. And so we form part of that major river basin, and that's where most of the farming areas are also included. Where I personally thought that maybe the local farming areas around here should be included in the river basin is because the runoff from their farming activities are the things that affect our river basin, which is a wider impact because, of course, those rivers flow downstream and affect other towns like Swellendam and eventually Witstrand. Whereas in our place-based community, we're much more concerned about just what happens here. Again, no hard and fast rules. And the other point that we made is that these are like Russian nested dolls. You can be working on a very small place-based initiative, but it still forms part of the wider ecosystem. So these distinctions as to what we refer to when we say the Valley of Six place-based initiative will define exactly what that means. Then this gives rise to the next largest level, which is nationally. So in other words, if you take the individual place-based activities and we replicate that into other places along a river, so that we've got a river basin strategy, and you then replicate that river basin strategy into other river basins, it becomes a national approach. So to help explain that, we've created something called the RISE framework, where RISE stands for Resilient, Integrated Stewardship Ecosystems. We'll unpack that in a little bit, but just to give you a sense of what it is. And then ultimately, once we've got that level of collaboration happening across our country, South Africa, there's no reason why it can't expand all the way through the rest of Africa and ultimately become role models for others in the world also concerned about approaches. So ultimately, although we're starting in the Valley, this could be replicable globally. The challenge is the collaboration part. And so part of what we're trying to demonstrate in this activity is showing that we can make this level of collaboration happen, importantly, without the influence of the market. That's the invisible hand that currently coordinates all human activities. And then without any kind of policy changes at government level. It should be something that can emerge from the bottom up, which is usually what happens at the end of a complex civilization. There's a new idea that springs up from grassroots levels. So this is just putting in context what we're going to be doing in the Valley in context of the first part of the conversation. The RISE framework came as a result of conversations with Mazars, which is an auditing firm. I'll speak a little bit more about them later in this video. But they needed a framework with a simple name that they could use to take to their corporate clients. And so this is our quick definition. There's 4 parts to RISE. Number 1, it's a framework for national resilience. And resilience means the ability to bounce back from any systemic shock. And a systemic shock can happen at a number of levels. 3 examples are ecologically. We can have complete environmental breakdown. It can be economically. We can have an entire crash of the economic system. And it can happen socially. We can have a repeat, for example, of the KZN riots across the entire country, where the people that are feeling unfairly left out of an economic system can rise up against the system itself. So that's the first bit. It's a framework for national resilience, which incidentally is not coming from government. All the more important for us for this to be a citizen-led initiative. The second part is it leverages multi-stakeholder collaboration. So very simply at this stage, it's a collaboration between the private sector, South African corporates, and communities like ourselves in rural areas. We'll get into more detail about it is, but that's what we mean by multi-stakeholder collaboration. It's not only the stakeholders in this valley. There are people outside of the valley that are dependent on natural resources, specifically water, that come from here, part of a wider conversation. The third part of this framework, it's to transform ecological stewardship. Stewardship now is talking about meaningful work. So rather than people going off to a job in a city which may not be that fulfilling, we're now creating fulfilling, meaningful work in our local communities. And if we get this right, it'll be able to attract people from cities who are currently unemployed, so that the more people we have within this ecosystem, the healthier the ecosystem becomes. In our current systems, the more people you have, the more pressure is on the ecosystem, and therefore you generally want people to stay away. In our design, we should be able to turn that on its head. So ecological stewardship is the looking after of the ecological and natural resources that make life possible. And then the fourth point is to turn the ecological stewardship into measurable, tradable impact. So while we're not setting out to create businesses, we also recognize the need to have financial capital flowing in from externally to bootstrap or kickstart the activities that happen within the valley. There's much more to unpack here, but just so that you know, this is the framework that we've shared with Mazars, and they found it very useful and are quite excited about taking it forward. More about that in a while. Okay, so the point of these next 2 slides was just to give you an indication of who we're already in relationship with. So it's a list of organizations, initiatives, both internationally and in South Africa, that we've had numerous conversations with and are at various levels of engagement with them to help us with what we'd like to do in the valley here. So the first, Transition Network, is a movement of communities coming together to reimagine and rebuild our world. So Greyton Transition Town has been part of that network for quite some time. We're reviving that now and extending the scope of our conversations. Towns Action Networks is a small town citizen-led alternatives to the destructive service delivery protests. So rather than getting upset with local government and municipalities that are not doing their job, this is a way of us stepping in and proactively taking on some of those roles. Ronyaka is an urban planning social enterprise, and they've already been very active in the valley. We've had our first stakeholder engagement process that brought all of the individual initiatives, NGOs, charities, people working for change in the valley. It brought 90 of those people together. We had a follow-up presentation of the results that came out of that first activity. And at the end of July, there's another feedback session. The point of all of this is that it's managed to bring people that normally wouldn't talk to each other together, and to get the conversation going about what it means to work together to revive this valley. Reimagine SA is a Johannesburg-based company founded by Mampela Rompele, and the key thing that they've built is the Letsema process, which is, again, a process of bringing warring factions together to have meaningful conversations. So their work was birthed out of Marikana, which was the mining tragedy. People that literally hated each other and couldn't look each other in the eye, they've managed to get past that with deep healing and reconciliation. And there is a need for that in the Valley, as I'm sure you know. The Wellbeing Economy Alliance is a network of people that are working to transform the economic system. They believe that many of the root issues that we're dealing with are based in the economic system itself, and so you're never going to get to meaningful solutions unless you address an economic system that is in service of the well-being of everyone in that society. The next one, And Now What, is an organization that provides facilitation, learning, and developmental journeys to make sense, to heal, to transform, and to reorganize and act as needed to regenerate the web of life. Just reading that from their website. So it's a small consultancy who operate in this space by bringing out frameworks and methodologies to help assist with how we move forward. The Design School for Regenerating Earth is a planetary network of learning exchanges focused on restoration of hydrological cycles and river basins. So much of our river basin strategy work came from the Design School for Regenerating Earth. An incredible group of people, all at different places around the world, all working on somewhat similar projects to what we envision for the Valley. We're on their map, and we're being followed by a number of people internationally to see how things unfold here. The next group of people, Mazars Auditors, mentioned them very briefly. So this is our link to the corporate world in South Africa and globally. Because they're a French-based company, their head office is in Paris. They have very good relationships with the French South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Very large French companies involved in that group doing business here in South Africa. One of them is Total, the company that provides petrol. Other major companies that I can't remember, but these are very, very big companies. And they're looking for less greenwashed ways of addressing their ESG obligations. ESG stands for environment, social, and governance. It's the latest iteration of corporate social responsibilities, and it asks companies to report annually. As they report on their financial results, they must also report on their sustainability results. What we've presented to Mazars is a partnership between corporates and places, rural communities like what we have here, to make real impact insofar as resilience, national resilience. Remember, that's part of our framework, rather than greenwashing and saying, well, business as usual is fine. We don't need to be concerned about resilience. Much more to say about that, but for now, that's enough of an overview. Rotary International is a large group of individuals who support Rotary and then look for interesting and challenging projects along the lines of what we're looking at here. They have a key focus on peace and reconciliation, and so we'll be looking to them for funding to fund some of those activities. Enact International is a law firm headed up by Cormac Cullinan. He's an environmental attorney based in Cape Town, and he's the author of a book called Wild Law, a manifesto for earth justice. So he looks at it from a South African perspective, but is very concerned about how our systems are damaging not only planet, but people as well. Schindler's X is an interesting legal firm based in Johannesburg, specializing in community currencies and alternative ways of coordinating human activity based on blockchain. Very interesting crowd of people. Ethos VO and the Commons Fund is a philanthropic fund based in the UK that funds meaningful work through basic incomes from philanthropy. So they make a pool of funding available for which you pay people to be involved in various regenerative activities. The key point here is that there are no set criteria. Normally, when you receive funding, you've got to make sure that you meet meet very specific measurable targets, whereas they're much more interested in the story and the narrative that emerges. So photographs of happy children that are receiving healthy meals, for example, photographs of land restoration where you've now got healthy growth bouncing back. Those are the kind of measurement that they're looking for, the story, the narrative. Transition Collective is my own initiative that I started towards the beginning of 2023. We ran a six-month exercise that concluded with a report. Though it consists of 170 experts from around the world that came together for regular Zoom conversations. Each of those individuals have developed one specific potential solution. So if you view this as a jigsaw puzzle that's been poured out of its box onto the table, so we have all of the pieces required that we need. All that we need to do is build that jigsaw puzzle, and they're able to play a advisory role, so we can turn to them for advice anytime we need them. The report that was produced says that although we have so many solutions on the table, there is still a large amount of fragmentation across any kind of ecosystem like ours. And we know that there's fragmentation here in the valley, but that so that fragmentation leads to a lack of impact, despite the good work that's done from the best intentions. Very often do you see significant impact happening. So once we address the fragmentation, is the conclusion of the report, we should have a much higher level of impact being able to be achieved. And then finally, we have SACLI, the South African Christian Leaders Initiative. This is a community of South African churches exploring a transition from racism towards reconciliation. SACLI was instrumental in bringing the first Ranyaka gathering together, because we first presented to a group of local churches here from the valley in a SACLI meeting, and the church leaders themselves pretty much said, we're not leaving here until we've agreed on a date for the first engagement. So they've already been very instrumental in some of the activities happening. Okay, so that sums up the people that we currently in relationship with. One of the things we discussed, although it wasn't in the first video, is that the point of these courageous conversations for the Valley of Grace is not more hot air. We shouldn't just have conversations that result in feel-good feelings. This must boil down to some kind of action and practical outcomes happening on the ground. So there's two activities happening in parallel to these conversations. And the first is the Ranyaka-driven one, which is the bringing together of all the stakeholders. But the second part now is converting the output of that initial stakeholder coming together into various projects. So the role that people involved with these courageous conversations is how it runs in parallel to the Ranyaka process, is that we're tapping into the significant intellectual capital that happens to find itself in Greyton. There are many people who come here to retire. There's a certain attraction that Greyton and this valley has, and it seems to attract the most incredible people. And our question is, rather than having them retire and with that body of knowledge no longer going forth into the world, how can we put that intellectual capital to work in a wider context, the context being how this valley can be seen as a prototype in showcasing what it means to go through this fifth transition into a manner of genuine collaboration across very wide stakeholders. So enough of that for this recording. Thanks so much for hearing us out. And if you're inspired by what you've heard or even curious about what you've heard, we invite you to join us for any of the following courageous conversations. They happen twice a month, one on the new moon, which is more of a presentation, and then one on the full moon, which is more a distillation, a conversation around what we heard. So we hope to see you there. I'm Michael Haupt. Thanks for hearing us out.